What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, we'll continue with the small forwards list. Just to recap for a second, number 10, of course, I had James Worthy. Number 9, Dominique Wilkins. Number 8, Scottie Pippen. Number 7, Rick Barry. So, at number 6, I have the great Elgin Baylor. Um, Elgin Baylor is one of those players, as is the case with most of these guys that played in the 50s and 60s. His overall legacy has taken a hit as far as people revering him or knowing anything about him. He's been relegated to the dinosaur era, and a lot of young fans show these guys absolutely no respect whatsoever. At one point in time, I would say during the into the 1970s, Elgin Baylor was seen as one of the greatest. He's probably seen as the greatest forward in history at that time. Even as recently as my teenage years, he was seen as a top probably three folk, along with, probably at the time Larry Bird and Julius Erving, you know, maybe John Havlicek in the mix. But he's fallen. Some of it has to do with the fact that there's not a lot of footage. He played in an era before these games were really even largely televised. At least in the 70s, so these games were starting to become more largely televised, and there's more footage around. By the time there was a lot of footage of Baylor, he was already on the downside of his career. His best years was probably between 1958 and 1965-66. Those were his best years. Um, a lot of the footage that's around of Baylor, he was becoming a shell of himself after that devastating knee injury that he suffered. I think it was in 1965 or 66. I can't remember exactly what year it was. But he was the closest thing the league had to a Jordan, if you want to compare him to some guy like that they had during the 1950s and 1960s. Elgin Baylor is the player that helped to usher in the higher expectation of what players were expected to do out there on the court. Nobody had seen in the NBA what he was able to do before him. It was more of a grounded game, more shooters. Um, Honestly, there weren't too many black players before him. There were stars, maybe Bill Russell and maybe Maurice Stokes briefly, Mo Stokes. But Elgin Baylor could do it all. You know what I'm saying? He was a great scorer. He was not particularly a great shooter, but he had a wide variety of shots that he could take and make. He was a great rebounder for his position. He was very strong for his position. He was 6'5" and 225 pounds back in that era, where a guy that size is akin to being close to LeBron now. Like for his era, that's how he kind of was like, what I'm saying? And he was a great passer. So he really had a great all around game. His career numbers in the regular season, I think, are 27.4 points and I think 13.5 rebounds. In the playoffs, it's 27 points and 12.9 rebounds. So he almost replicated in the playoffs what he did during the regular season. And he was the game's premier scoring juggernaut before Wilt Chamberlain arrived. All right. At one point in time, he had the record for most points in the game, which was 71, and was the Lakers franchise record until the late Kobe Bryant, broke it in January, I think 22nd, 2006. He had the record he still holds the record, for most points in the playoff game, the finals game, which is 61. He had the record for most points in the playoff game until Jordan broke that April 20th, 86. And he had the most points at one point and a half, but that was broken by, I believe, Wilt Chamberlain. But Elgin Baylor was born in 1934 in Washington, D.C., and was named for his father's favorite watch. A high school sports star, he didn't perform well academically and even dropped out for a while to work in a furniture store and to play basketball in the local recreational league. A terrible scholastic record kept him out of college until a friend arranged a scholarship at the College of Idaho, where he was expected to play both basketball and football. After one season, the school dismissed the head basketball coach and restricted the scholarships. Seattle car dealer Ralph Monroe interested Baylor in Seattle University, and Baylor set out a year to play for an amateur team while establishing eligibility at Seattle. Baylor played for Seattle University in 1956-57 and 57-58, taking the Chieftains to the 1958 NCAA championship game where they lost to the Kentucky Wildcats. In his three collegiate seasons, one at Idaho and two at Seattle, Baylor averaged 31.3 points. The Minneapolis Lakers used the number one overall pick in the 1958 NBA draft to select Baylor after his junior year, then convinced him to pass up his final college season and join the pro ranks. At the time, the Lakers were in trouble. And I think I mentioned this years ago when I talked about Elgin Baylor on my all-time forward list. The Minneapolis Lakers were in a lot of trouble. Okay, um, and this is not hyperbole to say this. If it wasn't for Elgin Baylor signing with the Minneapolis Lakers, the Lakers franchise as we know it probably wouldn't exist. They were struggling after the George Mikan dynasty. Attendance was struggling. They were a very poor team. Um, as a matter of fact, uh, the year prior to the Lakers signing Elgin Baylor, they finished 19-53, and the team was inadequate. You know, it was the NBA was changing at that time. It was more fast-paced game. The players were becoming bigger, stronger, more athletic, even in the 50s, late 50s, yes. But they were akin to the, the 40s and early 50s, slow white players. I'm just being honest. And they were struggling. And Elgin Baylor, when he signed that contract with the Minneapolis Lakers, he saved that franchise. Because if it wasn't for him turning that franchise around as far as ticket sales and attendance, they would have folded. Now, ultimately, they still had to leave Minneapolis and relocate to the Lakers. But if it wasn't for Baylor, they probably would have folded as a franchise within 1 to 2 years. That's how badly the Minneapolis Lakers were doing at that time. Elgin Baylor was not one of these guys that, you know what I'm saying, took a little while to adjust. To go more to my point, look, this is from Bob Short, the Minneapolis Lakers owner. He told Los Angeles Times in 1971, if he had turned me down then, I would have been out of business. The club would have gone bankrupt as far as signing that 20,000 per year contract. The club would have gone bankrupt. And yeah, so he saved the Minneapolis Lakers. As a rookie in 1958-59, Baylor was sensational. He finished fourth in the league in scoring at 24.9 points per game, third in rebounding behind probably, I would assume, Russell in 58-59. It was probably behind Russell and Pettit at 15 rebounds per game and eighth in assists at 4.1 assists per game. Now, if that sounds kind of low, look, you know, assists were registered a lot more strictly back then. I've talked about that time and time again. He registered 55 points in a single game at the time, the third highest mark in league history behind Joe Folk's 63-point game and Mike in the 61. That same season, Baylor appeared in the NBA All-Star game and shared the game's most valuable player honors with the Hawks' Bob Pettit. At season's end, he was an easy choice for the NBA's Rookie of the Year award. The next year, he averaged 29.6 points, good for third place in the league, and 16.4 rebounds, which ranked him fourth. The Lakers finished the regular season at 25-50, but still made the playoffs as the third place finisher in the 14 Western Division. They upset the Pistons in the division semifinals, then lost to the Hawks in a 7-game divisional playoffs uh, finals. Baylor averaged 33.4 points per game during the postseason. Then that's when they moved to Los Angeles. At that time, there were a lot of franchises that were moving to the West. In that time period, when you're talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers going west, you can talk about the New York Giants moving to San Francisco. So a lot of those teams were moving west at that time. And the next year, he averaged 34.8 points per game, second in the league behind Will Chamberlain's 38.4. On November 15th, 1960, Baylor scored 71 points against the Knicks in New York, setting a new record for most points scored in a single contest. He also had 25 rebounds in that particular game. During the playoffs that year, the Lakers lost to St. Louis in 7 games in the Western Division Finals that season. I'm going to kind of move a little forward with this one. I don't want to spend too much time talking about each season. The next year, Elgin Baylor was limited to 48 games because he was required to perform military service. And he spent half the year stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, playing only when he could obtain a weekend pass. So he appeared in only 48 games that season. Still, that year, Baylor averaged a sensational 38.3 points per game. All right, I believe that's the highest scoring average in a season for any player outside of Will Chamberlain. And it was that season in the NBA Finals against the Boston Celtics that Elgin Baylor scored 61 points in Game 5 of that series, setting a single-game playoff record that would stand for 24 games until Michael Jordan broke it against the Boston Celtics. It's still the playoff record for a standard exhibition game, meaning without overtime. Because I believe when that game went to overtime, when Jordan was playing, he had 54 points after the regular stanza. During the rest of his career, in the 60s, um, look, he was still a high scoring guy. He was second in the league in scoring at 63, averaging 34 points, 14.3 rebounds. He shot 84% from the foul line, almost 5 assists. He was sensational. But it's the same thing. His, dominance in the NBA, his tenure in the NBA was coinciding with the great Boston Celtic dynasty. And this was blocking him and also his teammate by now, Jerry West, from having success as far as championships concerned. Starting in the 63-64 season, Elgin Baylor started having knee trouble. This would slowly become more of an issue with him as he got older, and it slowly began to take away from his explosiveness. And also, there was a transitional period where, starting in the mid 60s, Jerry West was becoming the leading scorer, while Baylor was becoming the second leading scorer. Like afterward, all these astronomical years, he was averaging 34, 36, 38. It was more like 26, 27. West was averaging usually north of 30. By 1966, Baylor's knee problems limited him to 65 games and a 16.6 scoring average. But he would trudge on, even though he wasn't quite the same player. The next year, Lakers finished in third place in the Western Division and lost in the playoffs to the San Francisco Warriors and Rick Barry, who, as I mentioned in my last video, was having a tremendous season, averaging 35.6 points per game. That year, Baylor rebounded to average 26.6 points per game. Uh, at this time, Baylor was becoming more of a jump shooter, and this was a good thing and a bad thing. Okay, as I said before, he was not the greatest shooter, and one of the things that hurt Elgin Baylor, in my opinion, if you really look at some of these series, is you could say that he shot some of those Lakers teams out of the playoffs. Okay, this is one of those rare instances where a white player gets more blame than the black player. It's funny. It's crazy. A lot of people bring up the fact that Jerry West never won a championship. Only one championship. Only 1 in 8 in the finals. But Elgin Baylor never won a championship. Never won a championship. I can't remember what his finals record is, but I think it's something like 0-7, maybe 0-6. But for some reason, Elgin Baylor doesn't catch as much flack for not winning a title as some other players have in history, like Charles Barkley and Karl Malone. I don't know. Maybe it's because Jerry West is perceived as a greater player historically. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. For the rest of his career, Elgin Baylor would trudge on, but he was a diminishing talent. You know, um, even when they acquired Will Chamberlain, I think the 1968-69 season, Baylor, the team was better, but Baylor's output diminished further and further. Okay. 2 games to the 1970-71 season, Baylor went down with a knee injury that all but ended his career. He missed the rest of the campaign and then returned for only 9 games in 1971-72 before retiring at age 37. Ironically, later that season, the Lakers won their first championship since moving to Los Angeles. Baylor had ended his illustrious 14-year career without a championship. And it was also the night that he retired that the Lakers began that 33-game winning streak. So it had to kind of hurt Baylor a little bit. Shortly after his playing career came to a close, Baylor tried his hand at coaching. He was hired by the expansion New Orleans Jazz as an assistant coach for the team's inaugural 74-75 season. He served 2 full years in that capacity before replacing Butch Van Bredekoff as head coach early in the 76-77 campaign. Uh, Bredekoff had been Baylor's coach some years earlier with the Lakers. Baylor guided the young Jazz for the rest of that season. For the next 2 seasons, compiled a terrible 86 and 135 record. His team failed to reach the playoffs and finished no better than fifth in the Central Division. Baylor stepped down after the 78-79 season. A little bit after that, Baylor was elected to the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. In 1980, he was named to the NBA's 35th anniversary all-time team. And in 96, he was named to the 50th anniversary all-time team. In 1986, the Los Angeles Clippers hired Baylor to serve as the team's vice president of basketball operations, a position he would hold until 2008. After a disastrous 12-70 season in 1986-87, Baylor slowly molded his squad into a playoff contender. The Clippers improved slightly in each of the next 5 seasons, peaking at 45-37 in 91-92 and earning a playoff berth for the first time since the franchise was known as the Buffalo Braves in 75-76. Baylor won NBA Executive of the Year in 2006 when the Clippers would win their first playoff series since 1976. So when you look at Elgin Baylor's career, and you look at all of his achievements, he did not win a championship, but he is a certified first ballot Hall of Famer. So you have 11-time All-Star. He was a 1959 NBA All-Star Game MVP, 10-time All-NBA First Team, the 1959 Rookie of the Year. His number 22 is retired by the Lakers. Um, I don't want to mention some of his college stuff. It's not necessary. He scored 23,000 points, grabbed over 11,000 rebounds, dished out over 3,600 assists. And, you know, when it comes to the prototype for the modern day small forward, Elgin Baylor was that guy. He was the guy that brought athleticism to the sport, athleticism that we hadn't seen at that level before. And when it comes to the all-time great small forwards, Elgin Baylor is almost peerless. Very few guys were better than Elgin Baylor. And when he retired in 1971, um, a lot of people had Elgin Baylor probably, I would guess, historically as a top 3 or 4 all-time player at that time. So, yeah, Elgin Baylor has taken a hit a little bit as far as his legacy is concerned, but here I have Elgin Baylor number 6 all time at small forwards. Tell me what you guys think.